doing this. Thank you all for joining. We're really excited to be here to connect with the community. My name is Isabella Kaser, and I use she, her pronouns. And just in an effort to be more inclusive for folks listening in or with vision impairments, I thought I'd just give a brief self-description. So I'm a white woman with wavy, short brown hair. I'm wearing a reddish brown top. And I'm a project manager at the Public Health Institute. And I'm joined by my two colleagues. And so I'll just pass it over to them to introduce themselves before we get started. So I see Maripaula joined, but Maureen, you want to go first?
Hi, I'm Maureen McGuire, and the CEO of the Farm Bureau of Ventura County, and really excited to be sharing with you today.
Hello, my name is Maripaula Valdes, and I'm a research associate with UC Cooperative Extension in Ventura County. Thank you for having us today.
Awesome. So I'll get started. So again, thank you so much for being here today. We're really excited to share more about our project to develop recommendations to protect farm workers from heat stress and illness while working in polytunnels. So I just wanted to briefly give some background on the project and where we all come from. So this project is part of a larger program at the Public Health Institute called Achieving Resilience Communities. And ARC is a collaboration between programs at PHI, the Public Health Institute, and with community partners, government agencies, and ag leaders in multiple counties throughout California. And this project is funded by Cigna and launched in 2020. So have to mention that we're really grateful to our funders. And the overall goals of the Achieving Resilience Communities program is that we collaborate with communities to make measurable improvements in community resilience as they face climate-related threats from wildfires, heat, drought, harmful algal blooms, and flooding, and all of which are furthering disproportionate health outcomes. And one of the initiatives of the Achieving Resilience Communities project is the Ag Brain Trust. And so that is what brought together myself, Maureen, and Maripaula. And so this initiative, we work with partners in Ventura County and partner with community-based organizations like CAUSE and MICOP and Líderes Campesinas. We partner with the UC Cooperative Extension Program, where Maripaula comes from, and then also with industry partners like the Ventura County Farm Bureau, where Maureen comes from. And so I think it's important to kind of share some of the other projects that we've worked on, just so that you can have a better understanding of what we all do together. And so one of the things I'd like to is just the stories of resilience. And these are digital stories with farm workers, and they've shared their experiences working in extreme heat and in wildfire smoke. One of the other projects that we're really excited about is we worked with students at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo to develop water coolers. So it's a system that keeps water cold for farm workers. And so a prototype is actually going to be tested this spring with an industry partner in Ventura County. So we're very excited about that. And then one final initiative that I just would like to mention is the development of audio-based alerts for farm workers in Spanish, as well as indigenous languages like Mixteco and Zapotec. And this was in response to some concerns raised by farm workers during focus groups. And they just really wanted to receive information and alerts for unhealthy air and excessive heat. And then you can scan this QR code or follow the link if you want to learn more about some of the other projects and programs that we work on. And so Polytunnels, why we're all here today. So also known as hoop houses to some, or high tunnels. Maybe some of you are familiar with polytunnels, maybe you aren't, but there's some pictures here. And as you can see in these images, if you don't know what polytunnels are, they're a type of passive solar greenhouse that really shelter and protect crops from extreme weather. And essentially they support year-round crop production and are used to grow a wide range of agriculture and horticulture crops. And we're motivated to do this research and share this work because farm workers in the US are 19 times more likely to die of heat-related injuries than other workers. And given that climate change will continue to increase extreme heat events, there will also likely be an increased risk of occupational heat-related illness. And there's a lot of research and evidence to show that temperatures inside these tunnels affect plants, but there's really less on the effect to human health. And just a brief overview of the general area where our study and project is conducted. Polytunnels can be found throughout California's central coast, ranging from Santa Cruz to Ventura County, as you can see in this map here. And here in this region specifically, polytunnels are used typically to grow all the berries: raspberries, blackberries, blueberries, strawberries, and also some tomatoes, flowers, and hemp. And we decided to focus our project in Ventura County for a couple of reasons. One is that members of the Public Health Institute team had been working and have trusting relationships with both farm worker advocates and the ag industry leaders since the early 2000s. Second is that given the impact of wildfire smoke and extreme heat events in recent years, stakeholders are generally more open to considering responses. And then third, Ventura County is one of the nation's most valuable agricultural counties based on farm gate revenue, and also has a history of proactively engaging in social and ecological challenges arising from food production. And then you'll see at the bottom of this slide, there's just some additional context about farm workers themselves in Ventura County. There's around 40,000 farm workers, and around half of them are indigenous to regions of southern Mexico. The majority of them are not US citizens. About half of them only speak English, and then 30% of them identify as women. And so the purpose of this study was to, one, enhance the understanding of heat risk in polytunnels; two, to develop estimates of the acreage under tunnels in the Central Coast; and three, to develop recommendations based on best practices and industry input to mitigate heat stress for farm workers. And before I get into this slide, I just do want to disclose that I am presenting this specific research on behalf of another team member, and if questions arise, I would happily field them to her. And so we decided that, after looking into the literature and looking at statewide land use documents, we found no real record of the number of polytunnels being used in the Central Coast region of California. And so one of our team members at Tracking California, they generated an estimate of the number of polytunnels using California Department of Water Resources crop mapping data set. And then they laid the land use polygon boundaries over Esri's world satellite images to visually confirm and further refine the selected areas that contain polytunnels. So you'll see here that these polygon boundaries is what I was talking about, being pulled from the Department of Water Resources data set, and then they were overlaid on this satellite image, and this specific example is from Santa Cruz County. And so what we found is that overall there's about 12,750 acres identified containing polytunnels using the satellite imagery. And you'll see that in this table, we've kind of broken it down based on county, and then by different categories that are using polytunnels. And so over 8,000 acres of the total acres, which is about 66% of the total acres, contain polytunnels that grew bushberries. And you'll see that bushberries fields were also the dominant crop for polytunnel use when looking across all the counties. And then you'll see approximately 10% of the total acres contained flowers and nursery crops, and then 7% grew strawberries. And so, what else does this tell us? So based on an estimated number of workers required per acre to farm certain crops, the number of workers farming bushberries inside polytunnels could be around 41,000 in the Central Coast region. And now I'll pass it over to my colleague to talk about the next component of our study.
Thank you, Isabella. And I apologize that my camera is off. It doesn't seem to be working, so I'm just gonna keep it off. So I'll be covering two components of this study. The first one is the literature review, which is what we started with, and then I will also talk a little bit about the grower survey. So the literature review, what was the objective of this literature review? First was to summarize the information that was already out there on polytunnel conditions, so the physical environment in polytunnels, and the current recommendations that were out there that were applicable to heat stress of any kind. And then the objective of this was to inform the surveys that were coming after, but as well as the new recommendations that we were going to put together at the end of the study. The literature review was separated in two sections. It did have a lot of different topics contained within, but I think the two most logical parts of it were the focus on the physical environment. So trying to find as much information as possible about temperature and relative humidity inside and outside polytunnels. So any studies that measure both of these at the same time, so that we could look at those differences, any articles that were looking at the patterns or trying to predict heat in the polytunnels. And then the second section focuses more on the human aspect. So any effects of heat, and even better if it was specifically for heat risk inside the polytunnels, and then obviously any recommendations that were already out there, including all the risk factors, the thresholds, and then any tools that could be used to either mitigate or monitor heat in the polytunnels. Next. The physical environment in a polytunnel is complex. We have heat and humidity that are some of the most important aspects when we're talking about heat risk. But these two factors can change depending on many other characteristics of the polytunnel. So it can change with shape, size, the materials that were used, the height, position, the sun exposure. Obviously, in this study, we focused on Ventura County, but polytunnels are used all over the world, and so climate will change that as well. Wind speed and direction, but even plant size and density, and there's many other aspects that can change this. Next. So one of the first things we did was try to find as many articles as we could that had measured heat in the polytunnels, especially if they had made measurements inside and outside and could show what the difference was between inside and outside a polytunnel. We found that many articles that had measured heat inside the polytunnels did not measure it outside. Most of these articles were not necessarily focused on measuring risk or heat stress. Most of these were actually focused on plant health, but it served for what we needed, which was to try to get an idea of what these differences were between inside and outside a polytunnel. And what we found is that this was very variable. It was really hard to predict what heat inside a polytunnel was, and this makes sense if we think about what I just talked in the previous slide, right? So the other things that will change this is differences in the way the data was collected. So all of these articles were using very different ways. They measured different tools, and they calculated and reported it in many different ways. But I want to point out here that we were able to find some data that was local data from an advisor here at UC Cooperative Extension, who a few years ago actually measured heat and temperature and relative humidity inside and outside the polytunnel. They measured a maximum temperature inside a polytunnel of 38 degrees Celsius in April, which I think is very, very significant. And I will talk a little bit more about that later. But then if we just look through some of these examples in this table, we can see that it really varies a lot. And not only it varies a lot in what the maximum temperature could be, but also it varies on what the difference between inside and outside will be. And these are articles from all over the world, which influences that, but there are also all of these other factors that are influencing it. So next. Other than all of these external factors or physical factors that will change the average temperatures or the maximum temperatures, we will also find that there are microclimates inside these polytunnels. So it isn't one temperature that is constant everywhere, but we'll find pockets of very high temperatures inside the same tunnel. So it's really, really important that these are actually measured throughout the areas, and it's very hard to predict. We can see in this figure on the right that they looked at different scenarios with different wind velocity, wind direction, different positions of the polytunnels, and they got very different results for all of these. So changing any of these variables or factors will change the microclimates. And one other thing that I wanted to point out from the table is that and I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but the maximum temperature that was measured here in Ventura County inside a polytunnel was 52 degrees Celsius. Next. So these graphs are, and I'm gonna go quickly over them, but I think they're a really good example of not only what we usually would observe between inside and outside a polytunnel for temperature, but it also shows the variability that I've been talking about so far. So on the left, we see the red curve is the temperature at a weather station that's outside, and the blue line is inside a polytunnel. We see the temperature inside the polytunnel rising very quickly above that red line of the outside. And then we see that there is a correlation between inside and outside in the figure on the right. And it's a pretty good correlation. It stays pretty close to that line. But if we look at the next slide, we see that there is actually an opposite relationship here for relative humidity. We see that relative humidity actually decreases in the polytunnel at the same time that temperature would have been increasing. And if we look at the figure on the right, we see that the variation in the data, so as the relative humidity increases outside, we actually get a lot more variation on the data. And so this makes it much harder to predict for relative humidity. All right, so next. So going back to that local data that we found, I think it's very relevant that we had local data since there's so many factors that will affect temperature and humidity. And so this was a study on strawberries in polytunnels in Camarillo over 2 years. They measured temperature inside and outside polytunnels from February to April. And they found 2 really important points that actually show how it is really important to take into consideration as many different variables as possible when it comes to heat in polytunnels. The first thing is the first year, they actually did see higher temperatures inside the polytunnels, 1 to 3 degrees on average higher inside the polytunnels than outside, with a 72% irradiance. But on the second year, the irradiance decreased because this plastic is reused up to 3 years, and as it ages, it becomes opaque and irradiance decreases. So they actually saw lower temperatures inside the polytunnels on the second year. For relative humidity, they also saw lower relative humidity, which we already saw that was common. inside the polytunnels, and that was 62%. So as I said, plastic is reused up to 3 years and irradiance decreases. And although we are seeing a pattern that relative humidity decreases inside the polytunnels, this can still be pretty high. And we'll take a look at some of the graphs in the next slide. So these graphs are the data that they collected inside and outside the polytunnels. And we can see for temperature, we see that usually inside it will be higher, and it will usually remain under 35, but we can see that as we approach April, we see that those differentials between inside and outside, so the red part of the graph, we see that those are actually becoming really, really high, and that's when it reaches 52 degrees, as I mentioned before. So it's possible that as we see higher temperatures, not only we'll see higher temperatures inside the polytunnels, but the difference between inside and outside will be much higher. Next. For relative humidity, we still see the same pattern. We see lower relative humidity inside. That's the orange on this graph. Two things that I want to point out here is that the difference remains about the same between inside and outside, but we should take a look at how the relative humidity inside the polytunnels is still pretty high. It's usually between 60 and 80. Sometimes it still goes above 80. So there's still pretty high relative humidity. And it should still be taken into account when looking at the risk of heat stress. Next. So what can we take away from this data? First, there is a lot of variation between what we might get inside and outside because it's related to so many different factors. It's very difficult to predict because of how many variables will affect it. So we saw that there are very large differences in the different studies. So some of them only saw temperatures in the 20s, but on average, the differences don't seem so large between inside and outside. However, when we look at the maximum temperatures or the differentials or peaks in the temperature, we do see very high temperature between 38 to 52 Celsius. And that was here in Ventura County, close to the coast. And we also should point out that these temperatures will be reached early, especially in the warmer months, as early as 7 a.m. So that's really important to also take into account that the time when these temperatures are reached might be earlier than we could predict. So the other thing that is really important is that there are microclimates, and therefore what is recommended is that it should be monitored as close as possible to where the workers are. Next. So the second part of the literature review focused on the effects of heat on humans and the recommendations to prevent heat stress. I'm going to go over these a little bit quicker because I think many of you will be familiar with a lot of these very general concepts, but I'm going to repeat this because I think it's really important, but agricultural workers are 19 times more likely to die for heat-related injuries. And this is due to a lot of factors, but it can be due to lack of knowledge, poverty, the seasons, low levels of education, among many others. So not only physical reasons, but also many social and educational reasons. So it's really important to keep in mind when we talk about the recommendations later on. And so the heat stress, what is heat stress as defined by the CDC, is the sum of the heat generated in the body plus the heat gain from the environment minus the heat loss. Next. And these are different mechanisms will change the heat in the body. And many of these are obviously physiological mechanisms of heat change, such as radiation and convection and evaporation, so respiration and sweating. But there are external factors that will also affect the heat that's retained in the body, and this might be air velocity, ventilation, the relative humidity, sun exposure, as well as the level of activity. Next. So taking all of this into consideration, organizations like OSHA have put together different thresholds that define what the physical exertion can be at different thresholds of temperature. And this is just an example from OSHA, where they define that light work can happen up to 30 degrees Celsius or 86 Fahrenheit. Moderate can happen up to 27.8 Celsius, and heavy up to 26.1. And on the right side, you can see these are some examples that have been provided by OSHA and other organizations to help workers and growers and other people that are at risk of heat stress define what they should be doing at different temperatures and relative humidities. And on the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the heat index. And this is a common tool used because it's really easy to you only need temperature and relative humidity, which are easy to measure. So you can use both of those to come to the heat index temperature, which can then later on be used to define what the temperature and the exertion can be at that defined temperature. So for example, as I mentioned before, you only need temperature and heat and relative humidity, and it does not assume 100%, which previously the thresholds that were defined by OSHA, they assumed 100% relative humidity. In this case, you can take relative humidity into account, which is a benefit. However, it assumes shady conditions, which, as we know, are usually not going to be met by agricultural work. That includes outside as well as inside the polytunnels. And sun exposure or exposure to irradiance, that can increase the heat index value by 15 Fahrenheit. So quite a bit. And so, for example, for some of the measurements that we had seen for Ventura, 38 degrees Celsius or 100.4 Fahrenheit at 62% relative humidity, that gives us a temperature of heat index around 124 to 129, which puts us into the extreme danger exertion. So that means that even at that temperature, workers would already be in danger of heat stroke, and this chart doesn't even include temperatures up to the 52 degrees or 125.6 Fahrenheit degrees. That was the maximum that was measured in the polytunnels. So next. So I wanted to point out the heat index because it's a really easy tool to use. However, a lot of the recommendations actually recommend that the wet bulb globe temperature is adopted and used more frequently, because this tool uses or takes into account a lot of other of the variables that we have been talking about so far. So it takes wind speed and irradiance and other factors into consideration in their calculations. There are other tools, for example, online tools where they can use some of the data that's available, as well as data that you can enter, and they can also give you values for the heat index and the wet bulb globe temperature. However, having a tool that can be used not only to measure your temperature at the site, but specifically, as I talked about before, it can be measured as close as possible to the workers are, would be the most recommended. Next. For many of the programs that we reviewed and many of the recommendations that we reviewed, some of the most common aspects of these programs included communication, which it's really, really important, especially when you have workers that, as we talked about before, might not have education on the topic. So monitoring, of course, is what I've been talking about the most. And then some other common ones that we all know about, which are providing water, shade, adjusting the severity and duration of activities, so using those thresholds, obviously rest and acclimatization, and then having procedures and people who are trained or even training workers to be able to respond in these situations and also know the risk. And then obviously having procedures in case an emergency occurs. Next. And then we used all of this information and more than what I can present here today. We, in the literature review, we also looked into ventilation systems and cooling garments and many other aspects of prevention that I haven't included here today, but we used all of this information to put together a survey, and we interviewed 5 different growers to collect information on what they're currently doing here in Ventura County, what is practicable for them to actually do and what is not, and how the current recommendations that are provided to them can be improved or enhanced for working specifically inside the polytunnels. We did this service in person, through Zoom or phone, and both in English and Spanish, and it included caneberries, strawberries, blueberries, and flowers. And the farms were different sizes, from 15 all the way up to 2,000 acres. So we got a lot of different perspectives from growers that are not only growing different things, but that have different capabilities of how they apply recommendations and how they can monitor and train. And all of those things were really, really different between those different growers. And we'll see a little bit of that in the recommendations later on from Maureen. Next. So these are just 2 pages of the survey. And I just wanted to quickly show this. We started looking at what are they currently doing when it comes to monitoring and how they manage heat in general for even for plant health, just in general, how they manage heat in their polytunnels. And then we moved on to what do they do specifically to prevent heat illness and heat stress, and then also ask them later on at the end of the survey, what do they recommend? What would they recommend to other growers? And so we used all of this information and the literature review to put together our recommendations, which Maureen will be talking about next.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll take probably the next 10 minutes to go over our recommendations. And then if you have any questions, throw them in the chat, because if you don't have any questions, I'll keep talking. So anyway, we created some slides here to share recommendations that we gleaned from the literature review and from the grower surveys, and then went through and categorized them according to the hierarchy of controls. And this is kind of a generally accepted philosophy around which types of controls are most effective. So the most effective controls are controls that eliminate the risk for the employee, like physically removing the hazard, and the least effective controls are personal protective equipment, because you're really relying on every individual employee to comply with using that PPE, and it's often uncomfortable or not necessarily easy for them to adapt. And one of the responses that we got from the grower survey that I thought was really interesting is considering whether hoop houses were appropriate at all. So this is the elimination substitution slide, because the main question I think that is very, is worth growers considering is the worker experience appropriate for me to use hoop houses here? And I'm happy to think that that's aligned also, because if it's too hot for workers, then it might also be too hot to grow crops. So we did have growers that shared that in the survey. And I'm ready for the next slide. So the next level on the hierarchy of controls chart is in engineering controls. And so we had a lot of growers who were talking about ways that they could change or manipulate the tunnels to reduce the risk to the workers. So examples of that are removing the tunnels or plastic covering when the temperatures rise. So keeping them on during plant establishment and then removing them later on in the season. Increasing the height of the tunnel reduces the hottest air in the work zone. And we see that sometimes in blueberries where they have very, very high tunnels. Locating the tunnels so that the prevailing winds blow in through the tunnel and ventilate it. Decreasing the length of the tunnels also increases ventilation. Building in gaps where the plastic is applied over the hoops puts more ventilation in, leaving the tunnels open. Rolling up the sides of the plastic so that there's more airflow laterally. And there are both manual ways and mechanized ways to do that. Some tunnels are outfitted with mechanical systems that can roll up that plastic, or it can be a crank system, or it might just be workers that are general laborers going along and manually rolling it up. Some can increase the ventilation by installing fans, or decrease that perceived heat by increasing the humidity. But as Maripaula talked about, increasing the humidity also increases the heat stress risk. So that was something that definitely needs to be taken into consideration. Adding shade cloth to decrease that irradiation, or other materials to reduce the heating or greenhouse effect of the tunnels can be effective. And we had some growers that would even hire a helicopter to come and spray chalk on the tunnels when the temperature rises at the end of the season to decrease that irradiation and increase the shade. And then decreasing the plant density or height. So if you had a certain number of plants in the beds, reducing that will decrease the transpiration, or going through and pruning your raspberries, for example, so that the biomass inside of that tunnel is lower, increases the amount of decreases the amount of humidity that's contributing to that heat stress. And those are the engineering controls that came out from our assessment. Next slide. So then administrative controls. So lower down on the effectiveness scale. Monitoring temperature and humidity to drive site-driven controls. So what this means is, going through using sensors, or just looking at whatever the temperature and relative humidity is with those charts that Maripaula shared, and then kicking into high gear on whatever your heat stress policies are. Avoid irrigating during the day to reduce the humidity. So making sure you're not applying water while workers are also in the tunnel space. Providing plenty of cool water for worker hydration. Rotating workers inside and outside of the tunnel, so they're only getting exposure to those high heat or high humidity conditions for a lower period of time. Changing work hours to reduce heat exposure. So starting earlier in the day, we had some grower respondents who said they were working much earlier in the summer months so that they could get the crop out of the field before the daytime temperatures rose. Scheduling maximum work times in the tunnels, so limiting the exposure that an individual worker was allowed to have. Scheduling required breaks outside the tunnels. And this is a big area of conversation because a lot of the workers who work in tunnels in Ventura County are also working for piece rate. So in order for this to be an effective control, there also needs to be special consideration for those working on piece rate, maybe calculation of the rest time cost or interventions that aren't just relying on the worker for a self-assessment for their breaks. And then implementing robust heat stress training for workers and supervisors, and then implementing a stop work policy for heat-related illnesses. So making sure that workers had the right to stop work if they were in unsafe conditions without retribution or penalties. Next slide. And then the least effective, but still worth mentioning recommendations are PPE, so personal protective equipment. Some of these can be cooling vests with cold packs, wetted garments, and then cooling bandanas and other garments like that, and personal fans. And there's a big call out here because a lot of these interventions increase the humidity for the individual worker. And so people need to be assessing whether or not that's appropriate based on what the relative humidity is. But they can be very effective if the relative humidity is low, because it helps with the natural cooling process that we all do through our sweat. And then the food safety considerations were brought up by several growers who said, you know, having wetted garments that might be dripping on the product would violate our food safety protocols. So these PPE recommendations need to be taken into consideration of all the risks on the farms. And but there are lots of nursery growers in Ventura County that may not necessarily need to worry as much about food safety considerations as much as a raspberry or strawberry grower might. Next slide. Then I wanted to end my portion here on the challenges. So some of the ways in which growers are challenged in helping protect workers against the heat impacts of polytunnels are the inaccuracy of the measuring tools to develop those thresholds. Maripaula talked about some of the weaknesses of the charts that are available. And then the lack of work alternative for those administrative controls. If you are only operating in polytunnels, then how do you make sure that you can rotate people in and out of those work environments? Workers that are unwilling to take sufficient breaks because it's cutting into their pay or their efficiency. And then one thing I wanted to call out to this group is there's definitely reliance of small producers on non-customized policies. And so they're really leaning on the heat stress materials that are developed, like those materials available from the Western Center for Agricultural Health and Safety, which is awesome because it means that they're getting really good materials, but it also means that they may not be educated about the specific risks related to ways in which they've changed the working conditions, like going inside of a polytunnel. And then, as was kind of noted in the comments, there's a lack of research on heat stress risks in polytunnels and what that working condition is like. And then we weren't able to find any studies that looked at the effectiveness of the interventions that we just talked about. So comparing some of those recommendations against the other to see which are most effective in reducing the heat stress risk for workers. And then last slide. So this is just a huge thank you to all of you and for the Western Center of Agricultural Health and Safety for having us. And if you have any questions, please contact Isabella. She's helping us put together a publication that we're hoping to go into an academic journal, and we want to spread our message far and wide. So if you see other opportunities for us to speak on this topic, please contact Isabella. Any last comments, Isabella? I might have taken your slide.
Nope, you said it great. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was so much amazing information. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody in the audience did as well. So we did have some questions come in. I want to say how much I loved seeing the hierarchy of controls presented, because it is such a critical and important way of thinking about hazard prevention and control, and engineering controls are the way that we should think about, let's remove the hazard entirely if possible. And so I really appreciate that, Maureen. Thank you so much. And we did get some questions. I think one that I'm going to pose first, and Maureen, since you were just talking, first, I actually want to just say how amazing it is to bring together people as you did, who are from the community-based organization side, from academia, from the growers. I think that you all did something that is so valuable and important. And so I just want to acknowledge that and say thank you, because I think that it is part of how we can really see change in the practical and real lived experience of workers and employers, and hopefully improve safety in the fields. So thank you. And Maureen, I'm curious, in your conversations with the growers, I saw you had several who not only completed the survey, but also were partners in this. What is the, how receptive are folks to starting to implement some of these recommendations? Because you have a great list of ideas, and what is the, what is the receptiveness?
Yeah, so one of the main partners in the project was Good Farms, where I worked for the last 7 years. And so there's a really strong relationship there because I worked in agricultural operations at that operation. And so a lot of the sort of truth checking of this project was just what were things I did in the field or observed in other people's fields, like adding vents. And so we were able to create that grower survey based on my experience and other people in the project's experience being in the field. And I think that connected with growers. But Maripaula actually did the grower surveys. We felt it was really important to talk to the frontline supervisors, not just the owner or whoever might be a member of the Farm Bureau. And so Maripaula did a special effort to, be in the field talking with frontline supervisors, and that added a lot more depth and I think authenticity to the results of that survey. So
Right.
All of these things that we recommended are things that are being implemented right now in the field. None of them were things that we came up with out of thin air. They're common practices that growers are using now. Sometimes the motivation is to increase plant health more so than worker health. But the knock-on effect of reducing risk for workers is a positive thing. So building that conceptual relationship between, hey, what's good for the plant might be also good for the worker, or hey, here's what the productivity results are if you start a couple hours earlier, like your neighbor is. I think those are going to be ways that we can open up that receptiveness. But we're just starting this process of communicating the recommendations. And so we'll have to report back on how effective we've been at changing hearts and minds.
That sounds great. A question that we received has to do, and this kind of connects to some of the other work that you're doing on other topics, is around alert systems. And so have you all just explored the possibility about either personal or maybe at the crew level alert systems related to possible heat-related illness, or the heat threat at maybe a polytunnel row level? And is that in use anywhere, or maybe at the individual worker level? Is that something that's being explored?
So, Maripaula, if you want to jump in, you can, but I'll get started. Most of the time, the heat situation is being monitored outside of the tunnel at the crew muster point, because that's how the heat stress policies for OSHA have been written. And I think that's an area of improvement for people, is understanding the difference between outside and inside of the tunnel, so that they can be motivated to start monitoring inside. Maripaula, do you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think you're right on point, where having them understand that there is a difference, that there are all of these other factors that will change what happens inside. And obviously they know just from their experience that the heat is different inside, but like having them understand a little bit more what is happening and how that changes the risk, I think it's really important. As well as, I think one of the recommendations of monitoring really where the workers are. It's something that isn't always happening as close to those areas as possible, and using the right tools for doing that is also important for them to understand. And it's something that not only we found out through our research, but it came up a few times about these tools and which tools they were actually using and which ones they found helpful.
Where do you feel like there are still some gaps in the research? I mean, it's amazing that you're really focused now on the implementation of recommendations and the outreach and education side. What, from a research perspective, do you wish you knew now?
I can take that one. I think from a public health standpoint, I think there's data missing on the actual impact to humans. And so conducting a study where we are monitoring the temperature, the internal temperature of farm workers working inside polytunnels would probably be the most valuable, piece of data that we could collect to further inform heat standards and regulations.
So, and there's been studies on heat illness. And so Dr. Shanker, one of our, the former director of our center, has done some of that work related to outdoor workers not in polytunnels. Do you think that might be comparable? And he certainly found that workload, such as piece rate, workload and speed, had a negative impact on heat illness symptoms. And so, a conclusion might be that similar outcomes might exist for workers in polytunnels.
Yeah, definitely would need specifics on polytunnels, and like Maureen shared earlier with the PPE, and having wet bandanas might not be the best solution in a humid environment. And so also exploring what types of cooling mechanisms, would also be interesting to look at.
Yeah.
I'd love to see more work on which of these recommendations is most effective to guide growers in how to prioritize those interventions. So, I don't know what the research methodology for that might be, but helping to validate those recommendations, I think, would be an awesome next step. And then addressing some of the issues that Maripaula brought up on those charts, right? Where are the right thresholds, assuming shady conditions, that kind of thing. Seems like a low-hanging fruit to update so that people understand the risk, given the tools that are available, even if they're not perfect.
Right. Well, we know how important adjusting to heat early in the season, the acclimatization piece of things is. Does it differ, or how does the body adjust? Are there differences between adjusting to the heat outside or outside in that tunnel? That might be a question that needs to be evaluated, because obviously there's already a temperature variation between the tunnel and outside regularly, but does it happen that those early seasons, those early weeks of the season are so crucial to how the body responds to heat? Okay, well, we are at time. I'll give it a second for another final question if anyone has any. Okay, so Dr. Fatala asks, are polytunnels considered indoor workplaces or outdoor? And if someone from Cal OSHA is on, please feel free to jump in, but they are considered outdoor workspaces. So they would not be affected by the proposed and new to come out indoor work or indoor heat illness regulation, but are actually under the current and in place outdoor heat regulation. But they obviously are very different than the working out in the field. And so I know that we at the Western Center for Ag Health and Safety are hoping to partner with Maureen and Isabella and Maripaula in the coming year to see if we can help them disseminate their amazing findings and recommendations to get them out into the world more, because it's amazing work and a lot of people can be safer at work if they have this information. I want to thank you all for presenting today, and thank you for joining the presentation, our seminar. We will be back on the first Monday of April for a presentation on the overtime law in agriculture and some data on how it might be affecting farm workers. So please join us at 4 o'clock on the first Monday of April. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Bye.